Okay, let's try that again. Shabbat Shalom and welcome. Thank you for joining us tonight. My name is Sandra Madoff, and I'm chair of Beth Israel's Lifelong Learning Committee. First, I wish to thank Sandy and Howard Bernheim for helping to sponsor our vocalists tonight in memory of their parents, Bertha and Max Bernheim, and Sylvia and Sam Stone. I'd also like to thank Stuart and Tammy for assisting him for a delicious Shabbat dinner. With all the catering and the quality that Stuart has produced in the past 2 weeks, we should be nominating him for the James Beard Award. It's now my pleasure to introduce our scholar in residence this Shabbat, Rabbi Lance Sussman. Rabbi Sussman is a native of Baltimore, Maryland. He currently serves as the Rabbi Emeritus of Reformed Congregation Knesset Israel of Elkins Park, Pennsylvania, after serving as senior rabbi there from 2001 until 2022. Previously, he was the rabbi of Temple Concord of Binghamton, New York, and associate professor of Jewish history at Binghamton University, SUNY. Rabbi Sussman has also taught at Princeton, Hunter College, and Rutgers, mine and David's alma mater. He recently completed his term as chair of the Board of Governors at Gratz College in Melrose Park, Pennsylvania, where he continues to teach. Rabbi Sussman is a specialist in the field of American Jewish history, has written several books and numerous articles on the American Jewish experience. Currently, he's working on a television documentary on the history of the Philadelphia Jewish community. He is also editing a collection of his sermons and essays, Portrait of an American Rabbi. Rabbi Sussman and his wife of 44 years, Liz Zeller Sussman, who's director of the Knesset Israel Free School. Together, they have 5 children and 2 grandchildren. His three, Mazel Tov. Tonight's topic will be a history of hate, anti-Semitism from Haman to Holocaust denial. We wish once again to acknowledge that our scholar in residence programming is made possible by Beth Israel's Hilda and Gilbert Hillman Scholar in Residence Endowment. Rabbi Sussman will take questions following his talk. If those on Zoom have questions, please put them in the chat. And now please join me in welcoming our scholar in residence, Rabbi Lance Sussman.
Thank you for the lovely introduction and the warm welcome I've received here tonight. It's very good to be back in Baltimore. I grew up on Marnat Road, if that means anything to anybody here. And there's a whole table of cousins, and my aunt is here as well. So thank you. To get it to my level, so to speak. Good. Earlier this week, I was involved in a Jewish Studies conference in Philly. And at the end, they asked me to give a walking tour of Jewish colonial Philadelphia. There are people there from Illinois, Tennessee, Georgia, and it was all over. Lady came up to me and she goes, "You're from Baltimore, aren't you?" So I'm so glad to be in a room with people who speak normally. Okay, this is getting all the technology. Hello, folks who are watching online. And there's a big crowd. You should know there's a big crowd here. And thank you for the wonderful Kabbalah Shabbat service tonight. Beautiful music here. Really bridged my own Reform tradition and conservative. So it was a Central East European experience, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. And I know that was a lot of work for the quartet that joined your canon. It's such a serious topic. It's hard to even know where to begin. Tonight, we're going to look at anti-Semitism globally. And then tomorrow, I'll speak specifically at Kiddush, I believe, or after Kiddush, on the American experience. I know that people are eager to get to the American experience, but kind of deferring that to tomorrow. The Devar Torah tomorrow, I decided not to go with anti-Semitism. And anyway, it's my favorite Torah portion. It's on leprosy, so I've got to dig in on that. And then Sunday, I was invited to speak with the religious school children about our family's experience on my mother's side and their experience in Nazi Germany and their escape. So that's the lineup for the weekend, and I am truly glad and honored to be here. Let me begin with an anecdote from about 35 years ago or so. As you heard, I spent about 15 years in upstate New York, at Binghamton, New York, where I was associate professor of Jewish history and chair of the department, and I had synagogues on the side while we were there. We enrolled our older kids at that time in the day school, the Jewish day school that was in Binghamton. It was modern Orthodox, but they accepted anybody, so they took us as well. And of course, the boys were required to wear kippot. So one day after school, I guess it was my job to walk down to the corner and pick my older two boys up, Benjamin and Joshua. And I was a little bit late. I could see the bus stopping. And no sooner than they were off the bus, they were surrounded by a group of neighborhood toughs who were taunting them and going, "What's that beanie you're wearing? You know, why are you wearing a beanie? Nobody wears a beanie. Why are you guys wearing a beanie?" And they didn't know what to do. And finally, one of the tough kids screamed out and said, "Let's get them. They're Irish." At which point my second oldest son said, we're Jewish, your expletive deleted, and managed to handle himself. You know, I wish this story about anti-Semitism, the long road of anti-Semitism, was only about ignorance. If it was only about ignorance, maybe we could manage it through education, but it's much deeper than just ignorance. It's a very deep phenomena in human history. It has been determinative in the Jewish experience, and for the worse, it's back. It's back. It's almost inexplicable. In the years I grew up in Baltimore, in this area in the 50s and 60s, it was pretty much a fading phenomenon. It wasn't gone, but it was fading compared to what is happening today. The year of the Eitz Chaim shooting in Pittsburgh, I remember my daughter-in-law had developed a custom of putting a blue illuminated Star of David in her window for Hanukkah, and my older granddaughter, I don't remember her age at that time, before Bat Mitzvah, went up to her and said, "Mom, maybe we shouldn't display it this year. There's a lot of people who don't like us." And that was a very sad moment for me, to think that after all that has gone down, after our own family story of the escape from Nazi Germany, that a 10-year-old grandchild already got the message, and I can't tell you what the effect of the current round of anti-Semitism is having on the rising generation of American Jews. People thought that it was diminishing for the most part, not gone, but diminishing in this society. And if you've seen any of these ads that Robert Kraft has been sponsoring, they're extremely powerful. And he took a statistic in part, I think generated by ADL, that although American Jews only make up 2% or maybe less of the American total population, 55% of all religious hate crimes in this country are directed against Jews and Judaism. So this is now a real phenomenon. I'm not looking for a new passport, but we do have a problem in this country, and it's important for us within the Jewish community to understand the story of anti-Semitism. So tonight we're going to frame it, I suppose, in a global way, and then tomorrow afternoon look at specifically what is going on here in the United States. When we use the term anti-Semitism, it's important to recognize that it is a modern term. It was invented or coined as a neologism in the late 1860s by a German Jewish scholar by the name of Moritz Steinschneider. He was part of what was called the Wissenschaft des Judentums school that opened up what would become Jewish studies like we have here in American universities. And he was reacting to the rise of building and rise of anti-Semitism in not just Europe, but the whole world at that time, ultimately leading to the pogroms, the Dreyfus Affair, and other milestone horrible events. And he coined the phrase anti-Semitism, he had a German version of the same exact phrase. And then very quickly, within 2 decades or so, there were actual parties in Central Europe that were using the term anti-Semitic to describe themselves. For example, a mayor of Vienna, Austria, we heard some exquisite Viennese music tonight, by the name of Karl Lueger, who you know because of the Luger pistol, actually ran on a party that included anti-Semitism in its title and its name, and as part of its program. Anti-Semitism, which was a specific form of animus towards Jews and Judaism at that time, soon became the umbrella term for all types of hatred toward Jews and Judaism on a historical basis. It didn't have a name before the 1860s, but it was a phenomenon. I kind of compare it, purposely so, to cancer. Cancer always didn't have a name labeled by doctors, but it was there. And the same thing is true of anti-Semitism in all of its different expressions. What I'd like to do is walk through, and it's somewhat chronological, but hopefully also thematic, the long history of anti-Semitism by several different themes, 5 or 6, it depends exactly how you categorize them. And I would say that in its simplest form, anti-Semitism, the simplest form of anti-Semitism really isn't that much different than any form of social animus. Whenever you have different groups that collide with one another, West Side Story, so you have Puerto Ricans and Irish, right? They collide because they're different from one another and they're suspicious of one another, and it has terrible consequences. And this is a universal phenomena. It's part of whatever the design flaw is in the human species. And it's interesting, by the way, to note that I think when Leonard Bernstein was first working on West Side Story, it was East Side Story, but they wanted a broader appeal, which is itself an interesting reference to anti-Semitism to make it work for a broader population. They actually took it away from Jews. Even the movie Avalon, by the way, it's not about Thanksgiving in Baltimore. It's about Pesach. But in order to make it work for the big population, they had to reframe it so it was more marketable. So in the ancient world, whenever it was that the Israelites as a people emerge on the stage of history, and that is a huge debate. You can invite a different speaker to come and talk about the origins of the Jews. From the time there is a distinct community that is Israelite and the ancestors of who would become the Jews, there was always going to be friction with other people. But from that point forward, I think the story becomes a little more complicated. In the ancient world already, there was religious animus, religious discrimination toward the Jews. And of course, the Jews were blamed for the discrimination against them. And some historians, most of whom are not particularly friendly to the Jewish community, blamed the Jews and said, look, the problem with ancient Judaism, and this would be, I would date it by the 8th century BC, by about the time of the prophet Isaiah, is that Judaism was monotheistic. And monotheism was a very different kind of religion, a different kind of theology than the other religions of the ancient world, which were all polytheistic. And the claim was, people like Arnold Toynbee, if you know that name, from British historians, that that polytheism, the belief in many gods, is by its very nature more tolerant than monotheism, because in polytheism, your God and my God can join a God club. The God club just has to expand its membership criteria. And we can all here on earth be happy that the different gods can get together, but then comes the Jews and their doctrine of monotheism. And I would date monotheism to Isaiah in about the 8th century, who says, I'm the first, I'm the last, and I'm the only, who comes along and makes the claim that only the God of Israel is the real God, and all the other gods are figments of the imagination. Well, that's a pretty big insult to other people, and it's an insult to their gods, and it sets the Jews apart as being kind of different than everybody else, because they're more resistant, or at least they try to be more resistant in their elite formulation to assimilation. We have to hold ourselves apart because we are devoted to the one true singular God. And just like our God, we have to remain apart and not associate with the falsehood of the other beliefs. So there was this idea that perhaps monotheism rains problems upon us. And it remains a difficult problem, and it's an interesting proposition with respect to interfaith and how much contemporary modern Judaism has had to morph itself so that it can participate, because not every religious community, as you know, is willing to participate in interfaith, or multi-faith is a better word really today, activities, because of their claim of exclusive truth. And perhaps this is what informs the anti-Semitism that is expressed in the Purim story, that there is a different people, the story of Esther. There's this claim, there's a people among us. It's a polytheistic society. It's ancient Persia, probably around the 6th century BC or so, that set themselves apart from everybody else. And why is it that they're apart? Is because they're devoted to a God whose name in Hebrew means the ultimate being, right? Yahweh or Jehovah, or however you want to say it in English, and we don't say it in Hebrew, obviously. We say Hashem or Adonai or something like that. And it set the Jews apart as a different, unassimilable part who were not cooperative in heaven and on earth. So that's a theory about where some anti-Semitism came from. There is in the ancient world a second form of religious anti-Semitism, which until the 19th century and then the rise of Hitler was probably the most important and most damaging form of anti-Semitism, and continues to inform much of the undercurrent today as we experience it here in America as the basis of anti-Semitism. And that was the clash between the Judaism of the rabbis, beginning in the 1st, 2nd, 3rd century, and the rising Christian church. And this clash between Christianity and Judaism is continuing, although in certain sectors there has been tremendous progress, like Vatican II. Some people in the Jewish community accept the support of evangelicals for the state of Israel. Others say, look, it's a different agenda. Maybe it's not such love after all. But it's all part of this story of this second form or really third form of anti-Semitism that starts in the ancient world or late antiquity. The basic Christian story, and I am not by any stretch any Christian at all, and believe in multi-faith activities, but their narrative, their basic story is difficult for us, and they have had a lot of work to do, and parts of that community have done an extraordinary job, and others not so good. But their narrative is very problematic because, as we know, central to the story of Christianity is the idea that the Jews killed Christ. The Jews killed Christ. That we are guilty of the crime of deicide, killing God, like fratricide, killing your brother, deicide, the killing of deity. And be deeper than that, of course, is how is it that the Jews killed Christ? And it's because they are in this narrative story. The assumption is that the Jews are a criminal class of people, that they are conspiratorial, and that ultimately they are evil and untrustworthy. And they call for the execution of the Son of God on earth. And that charge has stuck with us and stuck to us. And there are all types of symptoms of Jewish criminality. For example, in the Gospels, there is the story of Jesus going to the temple and overthrowing the money tables at the temple. It led to this belief that the word Jew, the proper noun Jew, is not just a proper noun, but it's a verb. That to Jew means to cheat somebody in business. Why did Jews cheat people in business? Because inherently, as a class, and then later in history, as a race, they're criminal. They're designed wrong. They were offered to be the vanguard of salvation by God and given the Torah, but they failed. And they lost their covenant because of their chromosomes. They just couldn't do it. In Jewish life, there are different disasters have been based on Jewish faults, but there's the teaching of the various prophets who said that we have an inviolable covenant with God, that even if we falter or our ancestors falter, that God is not rejecting us. It's just that we need to learn to clean up our act. By the way, that's why many synagogues take the name Emmanuel from the book of Isaiah, again, meaning God is with us. And it's meant to be a refutation against missionaries. God is not against us as Jews. God is with us, and we are still in covenant with God. And this Christian theology of Jews as a nefarious group of people has caused endless trouble for the Jewish community throughout its history. And I guess the odd part of the story is Christianity can't get rid of the Jews. It can't get rid of the Jews because the Jews need to come back to Christ in order for the second coming. So they can't quite wipe us out, but on the other hand, they have to continue to, quote, punish us for the deeds of our ancestors, and will frequently turn to a passage in the Gospel of Matthew when Pontius Pilate asks, do I crucify this man or do I not crucify? And the shout from the crowd is, crucify him, and be this on not only us, but on our children. So that all generations of Jews in this narrative bear culpability for the crime of deicide. It's a very difficult part of the story, to say the least. And look what it has led to over time. It's even more than the charge of Christ killer, or I was reflecting with one of my cousins earlier. I went 7th and 8th grade to Sudbrook Junior High School before Pikesville opened up back in the Stone Ages. And I distinctly remember getting off the bus and having non-Jewish kids flick pennies at me. That's not Nazism, right? They didn't stab me, but it was an act of great contempt based on the belief that Jews are miserly and penny pinchers and will lower themselves curbside at a junior high school to pick up a penny because they're not refined enough to withhold themselves from business cheating. So the word Jew became a verb. It led to a terrible relationship between the Jewish community and Christendom and the church and the monarchies, that the Jews were not accepted as part of society, that they were always alien residents. I think everybody, maybe my two younger cousins are the only people in the room not old enough to remember. There used to be ads on television in January, besides getting your income tax in the mail, your mailing. If you're an alien resident, please register at the post office. I don't think they run that anymore. Jews, wherever they were after the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem, were alien residents. They were not part of society. The concept of citizen had not yet really been redefined the way we have it with the United States in the 18th century. And they weren't even subjects. Most people were considered subjects of the realm. They were outside the structure of society and had to live by tolerance. The word tolerance is not a good word. I'm very sorry that the museum in Los Angeles picked the term Museum of Tolerance. Tolerance means we'll deal with you with a clothespin. You stink. So we'll tolerate you. We will tolerate you. Yes.
I'm going to try to move the microphone away from you a little bit and see if that reduces the,
Okay.
I don't know what it is.
Okay. I always thought, people don't sit in the front row. Now, can you still hear me? Okay.
Yeah.
I always thought, why didn't people, sit in the front row at synagogue? I thought maybe Rabbi spit or something. Let's pull it a little closer so I feel more secure. You're hearing in the back, you're hearing online. So the Jews were barely tolerated. They were barely, not accepted for sure, and barely tolerated. And there were always special laws about Jews. For example, if a Jew had to appear in a Christian court, they had to take a special oath before testifying. It was called the Jewish oath. And in some societies, they literally had to stand on a pigskin before giving their testimony. It was called the Jewish oath. The Jewish community was created in a corporate fashion, not as individuals. There is a Jewish community that we're tolerating in our midst. They're going to pay collective taxes. The community itself has to organize itself to pay whatever tax the king or whomever, or the prince, is going to impose upon them. We've all watched various bad versions of the Robin Hood story, right? And you have this terrible King John and the wonderful King Richard is off to the Holy Land, right? And Sean Connery is particularly handsome. King Richard, if you excuse me for bad language, on Shabbat, was a bastard of a man towards the Jews, and he was constantly robbing the Jewish community for taxes and unleashing violence against this odd alien body in the midst of England. And in England, in the year 1290, and I have English family, so I don't say this with much joy or pride, the English invented something or reinvented something the Romans had applied back in the year 70, they expelled their Jewish community, not to readmit Jews to England until the 1650s. They snuck back in, of course, but they were officially expelled between 1290 and the time of Oliver Cromwell, because England did not want this nefarious criminal class, and the Jews were set out. Jews were not allowed to hold public office. They had to be treated as separate. And in some places it got so bad that Jews were literally locked into ghettos or lived in quarantine areas and were not accepted by the population at large. In the 14th century, there are several developments that were particularly painful to the Jewish community. One of which was the Crusades, that had a practice of sharpening their swords on Jewish bodies on the way to the Holy Land. They didn't just want to get to the Holy Land and take Jerusalem back from the Muslims. They also wanted to slaughter the enemies of Christ who were guilty of the crime of deicide along the way. And that experience, by the way, is probably the reason that we say the mourner's Kaddish. It's not clear at what point that enters into the liturgy, but the casualties were tremendous, and part of the saying of Kaddish has to do with accompanying the soul between the death of the body and its final place in the next world. Became much more universal in the Jewish community because of the Crusades. Also in Europe in the High Middle Ages was the development of the blood libel. The blood libel goes back to the crucifixion story and said that this criminal class of Jews, in reenacting the crucifixion every year, needed blood for the baking of matzah, and thereby would go out in search of a Christian child, some pure innocent blood, and murder this child, and then use that blood, the blood of Christ, the blood of the Lamb, in the baking of matzah. There's a very deep connection between the whole Passover and Easter stories. I just wrote an article on it that I called The Bitter and the Sweet, or the Maror and the Haroset, because part of Passover, as we know from our family celebrations, is very sweet. But the other side of Passover is very, very bitter. There's a real Maror aspect to it. So there was this blood libel, and blood libels have continued into modern times. There was an immense blood libel in the 1840s in Damascus, Syria. It was one of the events that helped bring some unity to the American Jewish community. And even into the 20th century, if you know the story of Leo Frank being lynched in Georgia, he was accused of killing a little Christian girl by the name of Mary Fagan because of a blood libel. So it hasn't disappeared, and there are other elements of it that continue to creep up. So the Christian narrative by the Middle Ages had made life extremely difficult for the Jews. And at another time, for example, in preparation for Easter, priests would get up and tell the story of the Passion and what would happen between those sermons pre-Easter and the holiday. There were pogroms against the Jewish community. Why? Because they needed to be punished, because they were a criminal class for what they did in the first century, and because of their continuing bad behavior, throughout the centuries, particularly along economic lines. And that was codified into law, so that Jews were removed from agriculture, which was the principal vocation of humanity until very recent times. They were removed from the land, and a kind of economic theology determined that Jews had to do things that nobody else wanted to do. like lend money, which was considered ultimately in Christian theology criminal. So the criminals should do something criminal. With the rise of guilds and bankings by the early modern period, when the need for loans and interest became apparent as the world was moving away from feudalism, what happened? You have rising groups in economies that want to engage in loaning and charging interest, and the Jews have the business. And then they blame the Jews for having the business that they want to get into. There was a German Jewish poet in the 19th century by the name of Heinrich Heine, who converted out for practical reasons, who had a saying that first they cripple the Jew and then they blame him for limping. So Christian anti-Semitism, and there are so many people in the Christian community that are trying to deal with this in a forthright fashion, and progress has been made, particularly in the post-World War II period, initially led by the Catholic Church. They're trying to deal with this, but it's very, very difficult to expunge, to say the least. Judaism and Christianity have a daughter religion, and of course that's Islam. And they also become part of the narrative. From a point of view of the template, Islam actually has a softer view of Jews and Judaism than Christianity. It doesn't work out that way necessarily in reality. But in Islam, the belief is that Abraham was the first Muslim and that Moses is a divine prophet. And if one converts into Islam, you have to take your oath and saying, I believe in Abraham, I believe in Moses, I believe in Jesus as a prophet, and I believe that Muhammad is the seal of prophecy. The Jews were given a designation in Sharia, in Islamic law, which we adopted and internalized using a Hebrew name for it, Am HaSefer, the people of the book. And what that refers to in Sharia is that the Jews are part of a tradition of legitimate prophecy, which ultimately concludes with the prophecy of the prophet Muhammad. And in that sense, the Jews, unlike non-believers, non-monotheists, non-followers of prophets, are a protected class of people, and they live in what are called jimmies, in protected communities within the world of Islam. And theoretically, that should have served as a protection for the Jews in the Islamic world. And in fact, there were points of contact, and I want to speak about this a little more tomorrow in the Devar Torah, where Jewish intellectuals and Jewish physicians in the right place at the right time in the Islamic world were actually given a great deal of respect and brought into the ranks of the most elite parts of society. But in other places, the Jews were held with great suspicion, because at the end of the day, even though they were Am HaSefer, they were the people of the book, they didn't accept the prophecy of Muhammad, and therefore were incomplete and subject to conversion, and that they do not have the same equal status in the eyes of the Ummah, of the Muslim community, or of Allah, as true Muslims. And in modern times in particular, that relationship has soured terribly over the question of Jewish sovereignty in the land of Israel. There was a time, and it's so curious, in American history, beginning with the Barbary Wars and going right up until the years just prior to World War I, that it was not an unusual practice by this country and the State Department to send Jewish diplomats to Islamic lands, because Jewish diplomats on behalf of the United States could talk to Muslims in a different way than Christian diplomats were, because they didn't have the history of the Crusades. In the Islamic world, the Crusades are still very much a living part of history, and the Jews were not guilty of launching dozens of armies and navies against the Islamic world so that the Jews could, in a way, talk and negotiate for the non-Islamic world in the way that Christian diplomats couldn't. With the rise of the Zionist movement and a Jewish reclaim to the land of Israel, and therefore to one of the major holy sites in Islam, that began to change right away. And we know that in different periods of Jewish-Islamic relations, at some points it was okay to good, particularly among intellectual elites, and sometimes terrible. When different groups of Moors crossed the Straits of Gibraltar and went into Iberia, it often included tremendous military terroristic activity against the Jewish community. And today, depending on where exactly you are in the Islamic world, anti-Semitism, often camouflaged as anti-Zionism, is virulent and is one of the two major forms, or two or three major forms of religious and political anti-Semitism today. So we have simple anti-Semitism, we have the challenge of monotheism, then we have the rise of the other monotheistic faiths, Christianity and Islam, and their inability to digest Jews in their presence. Beginning in the 19th century, the story of anti-Semitism takes another turn, the worst morph deviation in the history of anti-Semitism. And that was the idea that the Jews are more than a criminal class of people, that they are a criminal race. So by the middle of the 19th century, you're beginning to get various ideas about racial history and racial definition across the world. And it fuels and links to anti-Semitism in a new way that is extraordinarily different than religious anti-Semitism. And here's the basic difference. In either Christian or Islamic anti-Semitism, you can solve the problem of the Jew by converting a Jew to your faith, and their sins are erased through their faith. But in racialized anti-Semitism, there is nothing you can do to change a Jew, because a person who is Jewish is a Jew from the DNA up, and Jews are not educable. In the Enlightenment period, the thought was human beings, through their faculty of reason, could be educated to be Europeans, to be cosmopolitan, to be modern people. And there are all these stories about if you took a baby and put them on an island, and how, would they come out as British or Jewish or stuff like that. By the middle of the 19th century, you begin to get a merger of mostly classical Christian anti-Semitism with new theories of race and then eugenics and other theories that basically teach that a Jew cannot change his or her stripes, that they are determined biologically by their Jewishness. Kind of a flip of Freud's teaching that gender is destiny. Jewishness is your destiny. And there's nothing you can do about educating or assimilating a Jew. This kind of racism and racial theory strengthens immensely at the last quarter of the 19th century. And it causes havoc in all types of camps across the world, not just the Jewish community. So it influences, for example, Jim Crow laws here in the United States. And it'll influence colonial white settlement in Africa and other places. That there is a racial classification to the human species. And this is ultimately what Nazism built itself on. Nazism took on a view that there is no human race, that there are different types of people, but they rejected the Genesis story, which is so profound, one Adam, one Eve, for all of humanity, that ultimately all humanity comes from the same source. And in this racialized understanding, you don't have this primogenesis at all, but you have different species of people who are incompatible with one another. Add into that mix a little social Darwinism, and out pops a kind of hierarchy of the races, so that there are certain races that have been designed by nature, by God, by providence, to be the masters, to be the Übermenschen, to be the leaders of the world by biological destiny, that they are the most beautiful, the smartest, the most athletic, et cetera, et cetera. There are other races that are dumb, and their job is to work for the master race. So, hence the name Slav, from slave, Slavic people. They're good for being coal miners. That's what they're designed to do. And even below them, of course, are people from Africa. And then there's this other class of people, in my opinion, influenced again by the ancient Christian narrative, who are nefarious. They're evil. They're criminal. And those are the Jews. And they represent the greatest threat to the destiny of the master race. The master race as determined by genetics. That the Jews are, in a certain sense, the equal of the Aryans, but they're programmed to be bad, whereas the Aryans are programmed to be good. And people who upheld this kind of view, and there were English ideologues who did this, and French ideologues who did this, and ultimately German ideologues who did this, particularly a fellow named Alfred Rosenberg, who should not be mistaken for a Jew, who wrote a book called The Myth of the 20th Century, which was the #2 seller after Mein Kampf in Nazi Germany, which was the blueprint for Nazi racial ideology. The Nazis came to the conclusion that they really only had two choices when it comes to Aryans and Jews. The first was quarantine. Gather them all up and put them in ghettos, or gather them all up and put them on an island like Mozambique or somewhere where they can't present any further danger to the world or to the Aryan people. By the way, this is the origin of what we hear today in this country, replacement theory, right? Remember the horrible incident in Virginia, Charlottesville, where the tiki torch people were walking around saying, the Jews will not replace us. The Jews will not replace us. This is this idea that the Jews as a race are looking to take over the world and claim the destiny
that rightfully belongs to the Aryans, to the white race. And white nationalism is a tremendous danger to the Jewish community, not only because it's fascistic in its political orientation, but it's also genocidal, because they don't want the possibility of the Jews to displace the Aryans from the control of the world and replace them. In this kind of racialized thinking, what is the ultimate weapon that the Jewish people have against the white community? What is their ultimate weapon? Mishlingen, mixed race, mixed marriage. Because what the Jews want is to get into the Aryan community and dilute their genes so that they cannot claim their destiny. In that scenario, who is the number one enemy of the master race? Children, Jewish children. And that's why there's an extraordinary casualty rate of 6 million, 1.5 million are children, because they needed to wipe out the Jewish genetic pool to preserve the purity of the Aryan race. And there are echoes, strong echoes of this kind of racialized anti-Semitism that are finding friendly reception here in the United States today. They may or may not know the history. They certainly cannot figure out that the United States went to war against Nazi Germany, and how an American citizen of any stripe can take up Nazi symbols and Nazi ideology, considering what this country as a whole went through to destroy it completely and turn Berlin into rubble is almost incomprehensible to me, other than the fact that anti-Semitism as a disease is so virulent that it can colonize itself and morph in so many different directions. So we have simple anti-Semitism, we have the rebellion against monotheism, we have Christian anti-Semitism, Islamic anti-Semitism, anti-Judaism. In modern times, we also have racialized Nazi anti-Semitism, which, unlike what preceded it, resulted in a government-sponsored program of genocide. The Crusades did not look to kill all of the Jews. Punish them, yes. Bleed them, yes. Inquisition, burn them, yes. Eradicate all of them, no. That is modern. And when that combines with the industrial capacity of a full-scale modern state, you have the very real possibility of annihilation. And this is what the Jewish people suffered in the course of the 20th century. And I don't know, when Valerie and I talked about putting this together, that this talk happens to be right on the heels of Yom HaShoah and the 80th anniversary of the Warsaw Ghetto. One of the reasons the command structure in the German military couldn't react right away to the Warsaw Ghetto is they couldn't believe that Jews were capable of fighting. They thought Jews were thieves, but not warriors. And they were shocked. They were totally, because it didn't fit their paradigm. There's one other type of anti-Semitism. And going through this and creating a taxonomy doesn't really help if you're a junior high school kid and somebody pitches a penny at you. Oh, that is a specific form, number 3.2 of anti-Semitism, and I know who you are and I can categorize you according to a taxonomy. That doesn't help. It never feels good, and it's always dangerous. And sometimes they're blended together, by the way, and they're not pure in any form, but they're a mix of different forms of hatred. But there is yet one more form of anti-Semitism that has come into play historically, and that is political anti-Semitism. At the time of the Enlightenment and the beginning of the discussion as to whether or not Jews could be citizens, there were debates throughout the Western world as to whether or not Jews could be accepted into society as political equals. That debate even took place here in the United States. That story is not well known. That's my biggest project right now. I'm working on a book on Jews, law, and the American Revolution, and how Jews gained the right to both vote, which was less difficult, and to hold elected public office, which was much more difficult. At one point, none of the 13 colonies allowed Jews into political office. And it was only with the federal constitution that we get a principle of law in the United States that Jews can be first-class citizens. And it took all the way down to the 1870s until the last of the original colonies got rid of their anti-Semitic restrictions on Jews holding public office. And at the core of that, beyond Christian anti-Semitism, is the question of whether or not the Jews are a people apart, their own nation, or whether they can be full citizens of another country. The apex of this discussion takes place in France under Napoleon in the first decade of the 19th century. He convenes two Sanhedrins. And the core question that is asked is, are the Jews a nation apart, or are they Frenchmen of the Jewish religion? If they are a nation apart, leave. If you are politically and nationally French or Italian or German or American, then stay and practice your faith. But you must give up your nationality. Okay, and those were the terms. Those were the terms. And the Jews said, we're Frenchmen and our religion is Judaism. All three of the major branches of modern Judaism began in that environment. But what happened is the movement to include Jews in society begins to fail during the course of the 19th century. And anti-Semitism, reinvigorated by racist theory, causes all types of problems for the Jewish community, at least symbolically, one of the most important being the Dreyfus Affair in France, where a Jewish officer is accused of leaking military secrets to the Prussians, causing the military defeat of France, that the Jews were a fifth column, a stab in the back, and they weren't really welcome as Frenchmen because they're not. They're different people. Okay? There was a reaction to that in the Jewish community that led to the development of the modern Zionist movement. The belief in returning to Israel for religious purposes, which is generally called restorationism, had been on the books since the 8th century BCE, since the Roman destruction in the 1st century. But with the Dreyfus Affair, many Jewish intellectuals, particularly in East Europe, agreed with Herzl and agreed with the budding Zionist movements that the Jews, in fact, were a separate nation. And they needed to pick themselves up and leave other societies and reconstitute themselves as a nation. And there was a debate in Uganda, in Baja California, in Alaska, or in the homeland of the Jewish people in Israel, which ultimately won the day at a Zionist meeting very early in the 20th century. With this new claim that the Jews could be reconstituted as a nation, a rejection of the terms of enlightenment and enfranchisement, a counter voice develops, particularly in the Islamic community, that says the Jews are not a nation among the nations. They're not a political people. They are not entitled to a state of their own. They can live tolerated under protection in their diaspora, but they are not entitled to political autonomy. And that is political anti-Semitism, which goes by another name, and that is anti-Zionism, which means that of all the nations of the world, one in particular does not have a right to the claim of nationhood, and that's the Jews. So anti-Zionism, ultimately, whether it's BDS or whether it's Hamas or whether it's Hezbollah, rest on the assumption that the Jews can be tolerated as second class, but cannot be accepted as a first class nation, as a first class nation in the family of nations. And we today are living at a moment, and that's what makes this moment so concerning, that we're at a crossroads where the old Christian narrative, where racialized replacement theory, and where anti-Zionism are all combining as a challenge to the Jewish community. And I think we have been disrupted. I think we've been disrupted. I grew up right here in this community feeling pretty secure about being Jewish and being American, and that anti-Semitism in the shadow of the Holocaust, in the shadow of the Civil Rights Movement, was going to eventually kind of disappear or shrink down to a level of no real threat to the Jewish community. But here we are, front end of the 21st century, when several strands of historical anti-Semitism are weaving themselves together and challenging the Jewish community. It's a security challenge, it's a psychological challenge, it's a cultural challenge. It's a very difficult moment. We're just beginning to deal with it, but I don't think we can make light of it. I don't think we can afford to make the mistake that so many Jews made back in the 20s and 30s and said, it'll go away. It'll just go away. It's marginal. It's the creeps. It's the weirdos. It's the internet. It's more dangerous than that. It's much more dangerous than that. I don't think we have to be paranoid, but I think we need to be vigilant. We need to be talking to our kids and our grandkids about it. And we need to be doubling down on our educational outreach and backing our defense organizations in this country like ADL or others who you may prefer. So it's not exactly a happy Shabbat message. I apologize for that, but it is timely and it is of concern. And tomorrow, what I'll do with you is to apply it to the American story, beginning with the colonial through the 18th century, 19th century, and 20th century. So I'll leave it. I hope we have a few minutes. It's pretty late, and I thank you for taking all of this. Okay, no questions, any answers? That would be much better. All righty. Doctor, what do you say? Okay. Here we are.
Thank you, Rabbi Sussman. That was really informative. And yes, a heavy topic, but
Yes.
we need to be talking about it. I just want to remind everybody here and on Zoom that Rabbi Sussman will be joining us at 9:30 in the morning for services. Please join us, and for a kiddish conversation later in the day, the topic will be anti-Semitism in America. Thank
Very
you.
good. Shabbat shalom.
Everybody bring their glasses up to the kitchen. That would be very helpful.
Please. Yeah. Yes. Oh, that was not mine. That was next to it. That was one block. Oh, I'm so curious. But we have the. Okay.
That was a smart thing to suggest.
Yeah. Oh,